Hello, everybody. I hope you're getting settled in and ready to start reading. I know we're starting off with a bang. This very first week of reading involves a novel by Mark Twain and watching some videos about the Civil War and thinking about history and the way that we view it and remember it. So I think John Green, even though he talks 100 miles a minute, has a lot to say that makes us really think about in retrospect, how we see and how we view history. Well, so for the Instructor lecture this week, I wanted to take a trip back to the first part of the book. And right before we get to Mark Twain, there's Emily Dickinson. And those of you who had American Lit 1 know that that's who we end with in American Lit 1. But in American Lit 2, when we have Mark Twain, I couldn't help but think that we needed to look at Emily Dickinson again. Emily's dates, as you may have noticed, her life, she was, my things are falling around. If you'll notice, her dates are 1830 to 1886. So she lived past 1865. She is classified with the American Lit 1 authors because of who she was and what she wrote about. There are, though, in Emily's poems, some things that resonate with the post-Civil War and authors, and with Twain specifically. I would hate to separate Dickinson and Twain because Dickinson asks questions that Twain then writes novels about. And so she, as you know, is a very, very important female writer. Sadly, she never lived to know how important she would be. She had only published a handful of poems before she passed away. Her sister found all of her poems, some of you may know this story, and had them published posthumously, which means after her death. So unfortunately, Emily did not know how famous she would be and how integral a part of American literature and history she would be as a primary female voice. I know we're not covering her as far as me giving you a 30-minute lecture or something on her, but I did want to give you an overview. Something about Emily is that she was ahead of her time a bit, and she didn't write about subjects that most women wrote about in that day, popularly speaking. She wrote about things that men thought about. She read a lot of progressive ideas. Her father would give her books and tell her not to read them. And some of you may remember that from American Lit 1 study of her, or just even in high school, or perhaps some former study you've done on your own. Anyway, like Twain, she has certain ideas that resonate with this time period, 1865, after 1865, where Twain is included post-Civil War. Certainly, you know, Twain was very anti-slavery and very anti-organized religion. And part of that issue had to do with the fact that he saw hypocrisy in church people. And so, I mean, he heard the sermons and noticed that the people who supposedly followed Christ didn't act like it. And boy, talk about, you know, how something relates to every day, I guess. But he was very disillusioned by religious people, and he believed that slavery was not something a Christian should or could embrace if they were truly a Christian. So you see a lot of, in Twain, you see a lot of angst between his ideas of what the church is, and he saw it, listen to me on this one, this is not an attack against your personal relationships with the Lord or whatever, but this is about how we view religion. And Twain had a problem with organized religion, and the way people, weren't changed, and they bought into ideas that didn't seem to mirror what they said they believed. Okay, Emily Dickinson, similarly, was also a very anti-organized religion in her own way, and that's why I'm bringing her in here as we start this American Lit 2. Her contention with the church was mostly about her being a woman, and so what would happen is the expectations placed upon her to get a decent education, but to become a mother and to become what women were supposed to be, a woman in the church, do something that was approved by society, she did not align herself with that kind of a belief system. And just as for those of you who may not know, I mean, she pulled away from society in her 30s. She rarely saw anyone in public, and people who came up to her house, she would talk to them from the top stairs or have prepared baked goods to send them as a gift, but she had a lot of anxiety. Okay, now back to the church. The expectations that the church placed on her as a thinker and as a woman were too much for her. And she saw a lot of hypocrisy in the church as well. She was an intelligent woman. Some might say that at the time, I mentioned a minute ago, she had the education of a man. So she didn't think like simple-minded people at the church. And women did not relate to her. And at that time period, a nice woman, I'm sorry to give all of this to you at one time, but her dad was very prominent, very educated. Her brother was prominent and educated. They were very powerful family. And so it was looked down upon that she was as intelligent as she was. And it made it difficult for her to have relationships with people, with friendships with other women. And then in that time period, that would not have been kosher for her to have very close relationships with men. As a matter of fact, she had a couple, 2 or 3 men in her life that we know of that she wrote love letters to, and not just love letters, but kind of had a crush on, maybe an intellectual kind of relationship. No one's exactly sure to what degree the relationship was, but she did talk back and forth intellectually to men through letter, through post. So at that time, it was highly looked down upon for her to even think of having a meeting. So because of that, she had a very lonely life. And I want to look at some of her poetry in the book, in the textbook, if you will, and that kind of reflects this attitude, this disconnect with the church and society. And Mark Twain's the same way. People who resisted just getting in line and doing what everybody told you to do without asking, why are we doing this? Or standing up and saying, this is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. And so Emily Dickinson had issues, like I said, not only being a woman, but being a very intelligent woman at that time. And honestly, you guys, that's pretty much why she wasn't published in her time period, is she was a woman. And might I just add, I know this is like a freebie information, and I know you guys are probably at home going, dear Lord, when will she shut up? I will, I promise. I want to look at a couple of poems with you. But I want to tell you, J.K. Rowling, yes, you know that name if you've heard of Harry Potter, they told her before they would publish her books that she had to use her initials instead of her name because they were afraid a woman's name on books like that would not sell. So they made her they made her call herself J.K. Rowling so they would agree to publish her books because they felt like people would buy a man's series before they would buy a woman's series. Interestingly enough, this is just a little like today's history. Because of what she did, there are a lot of women who have published the Hunger Games, the Divergent series, all of that. They got to write their names out. And Twilight. So all of those series came after Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling really paved the way for women to be able to write that kind of a series and attempt it and do well, and for publishers to back them. So I just want you to note that even today, we see these things come into play. And FYI, the other part I was trying to say a minute ago, you see that with church stuff too. People get sick of people being hypocrites. And hypocrite is not like, oh, so-and-so said a cuss word, that's not what that means is they say they believe in this. They say that this is one way, but they don't act it out in their real life. And that's the hypocrisy that both Dickinson and Twain rebelled against and really called out. And this is novel. All right, so let's go ahead and go to some of these pieces that I have marked. The first one is on 1195, and I want to just read quickly with some of these with you. And this one is called Faith is a Fine Invention. And this one gives us a little insight into what she was thinking and the changes in American history and the emphasis here. And it says, faith, in quotes, is a fine invention for gentlemen who see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. Right here we see, among other things, I just want to note, an importance in science and things that we can rely on, and you see this mirrored from in the time period, and this great divide that happens in American history globally as well. I mean, humanities too. Anybody? I mean, this is something that happens where people depart from everything has to do with faith, and what about science? We can rely on science. I'm not saying that this is something I embrace. I'm just telling you this is what she's saying. I can't rely on the hypocrites down at the church down the block who talk about me, ostracize me, and call me names, but I can rely on scientific experiment and the scientific method. Does anybody hear me right now? Okay, this next one I wanted to look at, I hope you're enjoying this so far. I know it's a lot. I just had a cup of coffee, God help us all, is on 1196, and I like this one because it kind of talks about going to church. I have always argued, I have taken courses on Dickinson, a whole semester of just Dickinson, and a whole semester of Twain, as well as other authors in my journey, at my academic journey. And let me tell you something, they weren't anti-God. Twain and Dickinson were not anti-God. They were anti-organized religion and what people in organized religion did. Okay, so embraced and how they acted. Okay, so I just want to say that. But this piece is really interesting. Some keep the Sabbath going to church, it starts. And for those of you who don't know, Emily Dickinson did not put titles on her poems. So the first line of her poem is the title. And this one's interesting. She says, I keep it staying at home. This is one of those poems that I argued that she says that she stays at home to keep the Sabbath. So in other words, she's saying, I do keep the Sabbath, I just do it in my own way. And I think there are a lot of people in today's society who could feel this way as well. And perhaps this is your sentiment, is that maybe you don't do everything like everybody else does, but you do honor the things that matter to you. And it goes on to the bobolink, the chorister, the dome. And here's the other thing, is that for Dickinson, nature was God's sanctuary. So we see this. This is just a beautiful American voice here, and I think it leads us so splendidly into Twain's work as well, because here he is, Huck Finn, and these going down the Mississippi, this connection to nature, and nature kind of being this element of exposure. Like, this is what's true. This is what's real. And she says, I'd rather hear a bird sing than listen to a bunch of people sing who don't get it. Do you know what I mean? So then she says, she goes on, well, I love look at that last stanza. God preaches, a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. Bless her heart. Who knows, she may have had ADD, I have no idea. But I love this idea that I don't have to sit there for 3 hours listening to someone. I can just hear him when I get out in nature. And guys, this is so beautiful. Here's what she says at the end, and this is another one I have always argued. Look at the last part of that. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along. At this time period, those of you who are in American Lit 1, remember this. I'm trying to go as fast as I can. But people were scared to death of their salvations. There was a lot of, paranoia. Am I saved? Am I not saved? And she says, you know what? I'm out talking to God all the time. When I get out in nature, I see him. I see his handiwork. And so this one, guys, there are some others that are just like this, by the way, but I just want to say she was not anti-religious. I mean, not anti-religious. She was very spiritual. She had her own connection, kind of like a transcendentalist. Anybody remember that? Like the individual responsibility to connect with the divine power, but she says, I don't have to do that way. And at that time period, I'm sorry, but you either had to believe everything everybody else said you were supposed to believe, or you weren't allowed in. So think about that with free thinkers. Think about that with people who say, is there room? There was not room for someone like Emily in the churches in those days. All right, let's go to page 1201 quickly. There are a couple of things I'm not going to read every bit of it. I'm just trying to point out some things to you. Oh gosh, I love this. In 1201, she just finally says, I'm done. I'm not going to play the game. I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not. I'm just going to be who I am and who I was meant to be. So she starts saying, this is one of my favorite pieces, by the way. I'm seated. I've stopped being theirs. The name they dropped upon my face with water in the country church is finished using now. And they can put it with my dolls, my childhood in the string of spools. I've finished threading too. Baptized before without the choice, but this time consciously. Here's conscience again, right?